fleet of ships returning from unknown destination back to the island of Santorini, or Thera as it was then called. And these could be dated, these paintings, because the island was buried in 1450 BC, so the Admiral's house was buried as well, and therefore the paintings must have been before 1450 BC. Now, there were 12 ships shown in this convoy returning, and they had remarkably advanced rigging, so that the sails could be adjusted in all sorts of ways if you were sailing into the wind, before the wind, in little wind or high wind or no wind. So there were 12 ropes which could adjust the sails. And the ships had a very advanced hull design. And we could see from the number of sailors on board that they were big. They were about 140 foot long, about 3 times the size of Columbus's ships. Now, this was absolutely amazing to me. Here we have thousands and thousands of years ago, 3,000 years before Columbus set sail for the Americas, we have ocean-going ships drawn in great detail in this drawing room of an admiral in Santorini. So the next thing we put our minds to was to try and find wrecks of these ships. And we were told there were 3 wrecks about 200 miles to the east of Santorini, a place called Bodrum in Turkey, on the Turkish coast. One of the wrecks had been dated 1600 BC, another 1300 BC, and a third 1100 BC. So as you can guess, by now we were really excited, and we scurried off to Bodrum to look at these ships. And they've been brought up from the ocean bottom and put in a museum in Bodrum Harbour. Now, the interesting thing is that these 3 ships were carrying copper, and the copper had interacted with the sea water, and it had preserved the hull. It had stopped the beetles boring through the hull and destroying the hull. So you had more or less perfect chunks of hull of these 3 ships, or to be strictly accurate, of 2 of the 3. Well, the result of great chunks of hull being well preserved, one of the results was that the sea currents hadn't washed away the goods which were in the holds of these ships. So in other words, what was in the holds was what they were carrying when they sank, and it had been there for 3,500 years. Now, this got more and more interesting because in the hull of this ship, the Uluburun wreck, there were goods from 6 different continents. There was African elephant there was hippopotamus teeth from Africa, there was elephant tusks from India, there was gold jewelry from Egypt, there was glass beads from Asia, there was amber from the Baltic, and copper from an unknown source, which I'll come to in a moment. So one of the things we decided to do was to go to the various places from whence these goods came. So we would go to Africa and India and so on. And we decided we would try and find out if there was corroborative evidence. For example, the ships that brought amber from the Baltic, was there any evidence in the Baltic that Minoan ships had visited there before 1500 BC? And we found there was. There was a distinguished man called Hans-Peter Duer, who was the director of the Max Planck Institute, who had taken his family for a seaside holiday to the place from whence the amber came. And there he'd found, in the debris of a very old town called Rungholt, huge Minoan storage jars, which were far too big to have come by horse or camel or whatever. They were obviously carried by a ship. And he had these dated, and they were 1500 BC. And he could say for certain that the Minoans had been trading with the Baltic, which means they had to go into the Atlantic and up through the English Channel. It was a 6,000-mile round trip in 1500 BC. We did the same in India. We went to find out if there was any evidence of trading in the places where the Minoans took the elephant tusks. Well, we found to our astonishment that two emeritus professors, John Sorensen and emeritus professor Carl Johannesson, had written books about trade between India and the Americas in 2000 to 3000 BC. Now, the reason they'd written these books was that the mummies buried, the pharaohs' mummies buried in their tombs beside the pyramids, in the stomach of the Egyptian mummies, there was tobacco and coca. So this tobacco, which only comes from America, and coca, which again only comes from America, he could say that the Egyptian pharaohs had been taking tobacco and this drug from coca in substantial quantities. Well, tobacco and coca were then unique to the Americas. So somebody had traded from the Americas to Egypt to satisfy the pharaoh's demands for medicine.
How did you verify that tobacco and cocoa were unique to the Americas back then? Just for the audience to have a context.
Yes. Well, that's always been accepted. No serious botanist or professor of any sort has ever challenged that. They accepted that tobacco in those days was unique to the Americas, and so was coca.
Okay.
Now, Sorensen and Johannesson their work had been, I won't say vilified, but people tried to cast doubt on it. But there was even more evidence that they'd found. They found carvings on Indian temples going back to 2000 BC, which showed sweet corn, maize, which again is a unique American plant. Was not found in Europe at all in 2000 or 3000 BC. So they could show that although it was unique to the Americas, nonetheless it appeared on these carvings on Indian temples. So there was corn coming as well as coca and as well as tobacco. Now, in the reverse direction, in middens, that is garbage heaps, very, very old garbage heaps in America, dating back to 1500 BC, there was Egyptian cotton and Indian cotton. Now, Egyptian and Indian cotton has different chromosomes to American cotton. So they could say again, they date this from the rubbish pits in America. They could say that in the reverse direction, Egyptian and Indian cotton had been taken from Egypt and India to the Americas. Well, by now I was absolutely hooked. So I decided that we have to go to America to see for ourselves what the situation was. Now, American children were taught until quite recently that the copper of the Great Lakes was of a great purity. It was 99.9% pure, the purest copper in the world. And we were told that huge quantities of this copper had been mined from very old mines, 2000 to 3000 BC, around the Great Lakes, in particular near the Keweenaw Peninsula and the Ile Royale. Well, we went to various museums in America, and we found photographs and examples of the implements which the miners had used. Now, the really interesting thing was that the copper which was mined in these very, very old mines had simply disappeared. If you added together every bit of copper implement and artifact and jewelry and so on found in America made from copper taken from these mines, it would be less than 1% of the amount that was mined. So 99% of this copper had quite simply vanished. Well, from then on, I was determined to see every